أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والنازعات غرقا والناشطات نشطا والسابحات سبحا فالسابقات سبقا فالمدبرات أمرا ثم ترجف الراجفة تتبعها الرادفة قلوب يومئذ واجفة أبصارها خاشعة يقولون أئنا لمردودون في الحافرة أئذا كنا عظاما نخرة قالوا تلك إذا كرة خاسرة فإنما هي زجرة واحدة فإذا هم بالساهرة هل أتاك حديث موسى إذ ناداه ربه بالواد المقدس طوى اذهب إلى فرعون إنه طغى فقل هل لك إلى أن تزكى واهديك إلى ربك فتخشى فأراه الآية الكبرى فكذب وعصى ثم أدبر يسعى فحشر فنادى فقال أنا ربكم الأعلى فأخذه الله نكال الآخرة والأولى إن في ذلك لعبرة لمن يخشى أأنتم أشد خلقا أم السماء بناها رفع سمكها فسواها واغطش ليلها وأخرج دحاها والأرض بعد ذلك دحاها أخرج منها ماءها ومرعاها والجبال أرساها متاعا لكم ولأنعامكم فإذا جاءت الطامة الكبرى يوم يتذكر الإنسان ما سعى وبرزت الجحيم لمن يرى وأما من طغى فآثر الحياة الدنيا إن الجحيم هي المأوى وأما من خاف مقام ربه ونهى النفس عن الهوى إن الجنة هي المأوى يسألونك عن الساعة أيان مرساها فيما أنت من ذكراها إلى ربك منتهاها إنما أنت منذر من يخشاها كأنهم يوم يرونها لم يلبثوا إلا عشية أو ضحاها صدق الله العظيم.
أحسنت أرحم أحسنت. Thank you so much. Welcome Dr. Sadik. The floor is yours. Let's greet him with a nice loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Thank you, Dr. Halim, and mashallah, beautiful recitation. It's wonderful that you started the program off with that. Assalamu alaikum. Today I'll be talking a bit about the theory of evolution, and Dr. Halima asked me to talk a bit about atheism and sort of responses to people that don't believe in God or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And within that context, one of the most important arguments that people that don't believe in God have against the belief in God is really the theory of evolution. And so within that context, I want to discuss a bit what is evolution and what does what is the Islamic perspective to evolution. And I'll have a few slides in this talk that I'll share with you today. I've presented it several times here at Harvard and at MIT here in Boston. So the content is a bit dense. There's a lot of content, but I believe based on the questions that I received from this group last time, this is a very bright group of students. And so if you have any questions, feel free to stop me in the middle of the presentation. So I'll share with you some slides, but let's begin. Let's see here, share screen. All right. So to begin, why should we talk about evolution? What's the relevance and what's the importance of talking about it? I think the best example of why we should talk about it is because when a lot of you will go to university, or if you go outside into mainstream society, you'll be confronted with these types of statements. This is a man named Richard Dawkins. He's a leading atheist. He's over at the University of Cambridge in England, or Cambridge University. And he's written several books arguing against the existence of God. So one of them is called The God Delusion. It's a very well-known book, New York Times bestseller list. So he's a very important thinker in terms of propagating the message of atheism. And one of the books that he has, he had the following statement. He said, "It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet someone who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not to consider that." So here, you have to recognize the way that they set up these arguments. First, they'll say that evolution is a fact and that you have to believe in it. And then if you believe in evolution, well, then the next thing is you can't believe in God, because again, if you believe in God, you're ignorant, stupid, or insane. So you have to recognize the way that these arguments tend to be presented, and you have to develop immunity against these arguments, because this is one extreme of the spectrum where you have to believe in evolution, and belief in evolution will lead to disbelief in God. The other end of the spectrum is this type of individual, a man named Harun Yahya, who many of you may or may not know, but he's a well-known figure in the Muslim world. And he's written a book that tries to respond to some of the arguments of Richard Dawkins. And what he tries to do is he tries to demonstrate that evolution never occurred, and that fossils, dinosaur fossils and other types of fossils are actually all made up. They're not real. People made them up. And so as Muslims, we shouldn't believe in evolution. Now, the arguments of Harun Yahya are actually just as dangerous as the arguments of Richard Dawkins, because what he's doing is he's denying the nature of Allah's creation, and he's putting his own story onto it and creating sort of this type of myth. And it's unfortunate because many Muslims get influenced by the work of someone like Harun Yahya. You go into many bookstores, Islamic bookstores, they'll have the books of Harun Yahya, among others. So what I want to do here today is convince you that neither Harun Yahya nor Richard Dawkins are correct. And in fact, the reasonable Muslim position is somewhere in between. So there is no absolute evolution in the way that Richard Dawkins is talking about it, and there is no absolute creationism, meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created everything that we see today as it is today. The real solution is in between. And so what I want to do is address this question: what does Islam, here I'm using quotation marks because obviously there's many different opinions, but what I'm going to give you is really the what I would say is really more of the mainstream opinion based on the traditions of Muslim scholars like Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, like more recent scholars like Sayyid Bihishti, among others, and try to address the question: what does Islam say about evolution? But before we begin that, I want to talk about Islam and the scientific enterprise, because Islam is very unique in terms of world religions in that it encouraged scientific thinking. So if you look at the of the development of Islam and the scientific enterprise within Islam, Islam had always had a very welcoming attitude towards science and not a negative attitude towards science. So if you look at, for example, early Christian history, you have people like Copernicus and Galileo, Galileo in particular, who said that the sun, the earth revolved around the sun and not the sun revolved around the earth. He was persecuted for those beliefs. So we don't have that type of relationship between Islam and science. Islam and science were always able to mutually coexist and thrive and build together. But having said that, I want to emphasize the point that the Qur'an is not a science book. So many people will look to the Qur'an for scientific insights, but the key thing to remember here is that the Qur'an itself is not a science book. It's a book of guidance, meaning it's a book that should open your eyes to the entire world, to the creation. It's not a book that just simply focuses on science. And this is an important point, because if you look at science books, one of the key features of science books is that every few years they'll come out with a new edition. So here, for example, this is a well-known biology book that's used in universities and colleges. You see here, this is the 10th edition. This is the 11th edition. Science books are continually changing to incorporate new information, whereas the Qur'an, there's only one edition. It's the only edition that's existed since the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and it does not change. So unlike science books, which continually change, the Qur'an is a fixed book that will always remain true, irrespective of whether it was during the time of the Prophet or the time of today, the year 2020. So this is an important point. However, even though the Qur'an is not a science book, the Qur'an does encourage scientific thinking. See, there's a difference between encouraging thinking versus being a science book. A science book always has new information and it changes based on new evidence, whereas encouraging scientific thinking means that the Qur'an challenges the reader to always think and to always seek new evidence and new information. So don't just believe what I'm saying. Don't just believe what your teachers are saying, what Dr. Harima is saying, but you're encouraged to think critically and to use your aql, to use your mind to always think. And one example of this is if you look at the Quran, there's roughly 250 ayahs in the Quran that talk about legislative things. So for example, they talk about how to perform the wudu, how to go to Hajj, how to perform the month of Ramadan. For example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامَ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. This is an ayah that's talking about the ibadat, like Saum, Salat, Zakat, etc. So there's only 250 ayahs that talk about those issues in the Quran. By contrast, there's 750 ayahs that talk about nature and natural phenomenon. For example, there's a chapter called Surah Al-Naml, the chapter of the ant. There's a chapter called Surah Al-Ankabut, which we recite during the nights of Laylatul Qadr, which are these nights. There's a chapter called Surah Al-Fil. And so all these chapters that are named after animals. There is no chapter, for example, called Surah Al-Sawm, the chapter of fasting, or Surah Al-Salat, or Surah Al-Zakat. There is Surah Al-Hajj, of course, but that's slightly different. But so the point being, the Quran encourages scientific thinking, and many of the surahs in the Quran, many of the ayahs in the Quran are specifically placed there to trigger critical thinking. So when you read the ayah, it's not just supposed to, okay, well, I'm reading it, that's great. But you're supposed to think, well, what is Allah talking about here? What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mean by this verse? And one example is from Surah 21, ayah 30. أَوَلَمْ يَرَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ كَانَتَا رَتَقًا فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ أَفَلَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking a question and challenging the reader. أَوَلَمْ يَرَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. Have the ones that denied the existence of Allah, meaning it's challenging the reader. Think, have you not thought? And what is Allah asking us to think about? أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ كَانَتَ رَتَقًا فَفَتَّقْنَاهُمَا. That the heavens and the earth were together as one unit before we exploded them apart. فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا. We exploded them together. Now, when you're reading this ayah, immediately you should be asking yourself the question, well, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mean here? What does it mean that the skies and the earth were all together and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exploded them? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ. And we've created everything out of water, essentially. See here, your responsibility as a reader of the Quran is not just to say, oh, that's nice, but it's to really ask the question, well, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mean here? For example, when I read this ayah, to me, it signals that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory saying that everything was a singular entity, but over 5 billion or 6 billion years ago, there was this massive explosion that caused the universe to expand. This is what this is signaling to me. Now, is this a correct interpretation? Allahu a'lam. But the point being that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking us to really think critically and to be reflective about what is being discussed here. So that's one example. Another example of where the Qur'an is asking us to think critically is Surah Al-Isra, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. So Allah here is saying, don't follow that with which you have no knowledge. Indeed, the sight, the heart, and everything will be questioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So on the Day of Judgment, you'll be asked, well, why did you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Why did you believe in the prophets? And if you just simply say, well, this is the religion of my parents, that's not an acceptable answer. You're challenged to always think, well, why do I believe in this thing? So the Qur'an is continually challenging us to think, why do I believe these things? And it's a very important point that this is really the foundation of scientific thinking. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes on further to says, الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ وَيَتَفَكَّرُونَ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا سُبْحَانَكَ فَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. So here, the features of the believers or the good people is that they always remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ. They remember Allah when they're standing, when they're sitting, when they're sleeping, when they're thinking. يَتَفَكَّرُونَ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. What are they thinking about? They're thinking about the creation. They're thinking about how did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create the sky? How did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create the earth? And they say, رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا سُبْحَانَكَ فَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. Oh Allah, you didn't create this out of no reason. So protect us from the punishment. So the first thing that I want you to understand is that the Qur'an is a book that challenges people to think critically and to always ask questions. Well, why is it that this is happening, and why has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this type of thing? Now, why do I mention this? Because the early Muslims took this to heart. So when they started to really reflect on what Allah was saying, they started to come up with the foundations of the modern scientific method. So I'll give you an example. A few years ago, the New York Times had this survey. They asked all of these leaders, tell us about the most important invention in human history for the last 1,000 years. So this is in the year 1999. The year 2000 was coming up, so the first millennium was finished. Here they were asking, what is the most important invention from the year 1000 to the year 2000 in terms of human history? So the New York Times asked a group of scientists, they asked a group of scholars, people in universities, and the answer that they came up with was that the most important person in the last 1,000 years was a man named Abu Ali al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham. So it wasn't, for example, Einstein or Edison or Isaac Newton or any of those other people, but rather what these scholars concluded is that the most important idea of this millennium was set in motion by a man named Ibn al-Haytham. So many of you, I don't know if you've heard of Ibn al-Haytham, but why is Ibn al-Haytham such an important figure? According to the article, Ibn al-Haytham was important because he developed the scientific method. So Ibn al-Haytham was very well-known, knowledgeable in optics and physics. And so Ibn al-Haytham wanted to understand how is it that human beings, how is it that we can see things? The theory at the time is that the human eye was shooting out like a laser. And so the way that you see things is that there's a light that comes from the human eye, and that light enables you to see. For example, here I have this cloth. Before the time of Ibn al-Haytham, people thought that the way that you would see this cloth is your eyeballs shoot a laser at the cloth, and then that laser enables you to see the cloth. Ibn al-Haytham thought about that and thought that that was silly. He said, well, maybe there's something else going on. So what he did is he set up a scientific experiment to really try to understand how is it that our eyeballs are able to see objects like this cloth here. So what he did is he made an observation. He said, well, if that's the case, you know, if there's a light coming from our eyeballs, we should be able to observe that eyeball. So he, that laser or that type of light. And he set up some studies. He stated the problem. He put together a hypothesis. He tested the hypothesis. He analyzed the experimental results. He interpreted the data and came up with conclusions. And then he published his findings. And so the reason that the group of scholars and scientists thought that Ibn al-Haytham was the most important figure of the last 1,000 years is because he essentially came up with the modern scientific method. Rather than just simply believing what you are told, he examined it, and he came up with a series of experiments and studies to try to observe what the real cause of vision is. And he came up with the modern theory that, in fact, we see things because light is not coming out of our eyes, but rather light gets reflected from the object, and then the light which is reflected from the object gets reflected into our eyes, and then we can see the image. The point being, Ibn al-Haytham was a very religious Muslim. He was, well known to do his salat, his saum, but it was because of his desire to get closer to Allah that he pursued scientific reasoning, and science was a method to get closer to Allah, just like salat, saum, zakat. These are things that enable us to get closer to Allah. Ibn al-Haytham as well in his writings talks about how these were things that enabled him to get closer to Allah. And in fact, here in Boston, at MIT, which is arguably the best scientific and engineering school in the country today, they have a statue to Ibn al-Haytham. When you go in the halls of MIT, they have a big statue of Ibn al-Haytham in one of the major buildings, highlighting him as being an important figure. In fact, there's many other figures. Another figure that's really important in the development of the scientific method in the West is a man named Ibn Tufayyid. He has a famous book called Hayy ibn Yaqdhan. And this book was really an important book in terms of the development of some of the thinking of people like Newton, Kant, Rousseau, Karl Marx, Locke, among others. And this book by Hayy ibn Yaqdhan, it's a really interesting story. It's a small story. I would urge all of you to read it. It talks about a boy named Hayy ibn Yaqdhan. So Hayy ibn Yaqdhan is born in a jungle, and he has no parents, so he has no one to really teach him the nature of life or the nature of reality. But what Hayy ibn Yaqdhan does is he observes nature. And he observes the creation, he observes the birds, he observes plants, the sun, the stars, and he comes up with a conclusion that there has to be a creator, there has to be a God, there has to be Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the reason that this inspired many people in the West is because it really demonstrated the importance of the aqd to human development. So this book by Hayy ibn Yaqdhan, this book called Hayy ibn Yaqdhan by Ibn Tufayyid was an important book that really triggered many of the scientific foundations in the West. And if you're interested in reading more about this, there's a really interesting book that's called The Vital Roots of European Enlightenment, Ibn Tufayyid's Influence on Modern Western Thought. So the point being that you have these really important Muslims like Ibn Haytham, like Ibn Tufayyid, like Jabir ibn Hayyan, among many others, who were religious Muslims but they pursued the scientific method, and that pursuit of the scientific method enabled them to make a major influence and a major impact on Western scientific thinking and Western enlightenment and Western thought. And so to conclude this first part, science and Islam are not contradictory to each other. Science and Islam are actually very complementary to each other. And when we look at early scientific history, we see many, religious Muslims, people that believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they used science as a way to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So having said that, now I want to transition into some definition of terms related to evolution. So this is not evolution. This is a very common depiction of what evolution is. And essentially the depiction is that it's a very linear progress, meaning you initially had monkeys, and those monkeys turned into a walking individual, and that walking individual eventually turned into a human. So this is a common misconception, but this is not what evolution is. Evolution is essentially the idea that over time, every creation or every organism on Earth will undergo some sort of mutation to their DNA, and that mutation to their DNA leads to the development of new organisms. But a lot of times those mutations tend to be random, so there's no real design in terms of how those mutations happen. But because of things like exposure to UV rays or other external challenges, your blueprint or your DNA or your RNA, in case of a virus, undergoes changes, and those changes lead to new versions of that same organism. So I know that's somewhat of a difficult concept to understand, but well, maybe the best way to really demonstrate what I'm talking about here is to talk about the coronavirus. Coronavirus, we're seeing evolution in real time in front of our eyes. So this is what the coronavirus looks like. It's composed of RNA, which is really the blueprint of what makes the coronavirus essentially be able to survive. So the coronavirus genome or the RNA of the coronavirus is composed of 30,000 letters. So essentially, humans, by contrast, we're made up of 2 billion letters. Our letters are made up of DNA. So here, the coronavirus is made up of only 30,000 letters. But those 30,000 letters make up what the coronavirus. So it's letters like adenine, cytosine, thymine, guanine, etc., that make up the instructions or the blueprints for how you make the coronavirus. Now, the original coronavirus looked like this, composed of 30,000 letters. But since April, from December to April, there have been over 4,400 changes to the coronavirus genome. So think about it this way. The original coronavirus genome or the blueprint is composed of 30,000 letters. Only within a period of 4 months, from December to April, this genome, this virus has undergone 4,400 different changes to its blueprint. So, and some of the changes, it's in this part of the blueprint, which encodes for this protein, ORF1, or the spike protein. The spike protein is this protein right here. It's encoded in the red. Between December and April, there have been this many changes to that part of the coronavirus genome. And in fact, we see that in terms of the spread of the virus. So for example, in the United States, there's over 500 different types of coronavirus 19, COVID-19. In China, there's over 500 types of COVID-19. All of these started from an original form, which is this original version, but because they go into different environments and get exposed to different types of mutations, they develop and evolve into becoming essentially different types of COVID-19. And that's very similar to humans as well. So with humans, all of us started off as an original Bani Adam, Prophet Adam alayhi salam, or Hawa alayhi salam. But over time, because we went into different areas and different environments, those environments led to different mutations in our own blueprints, which led to different changes in terms of humans on Earth today. So humans today, we share 99.9% of our DNA, but there are differences. And those are the differences that, for example, give me slightly whiter skin, give other people slightly darker skin, give some people blonde hair, give some people brown hair. So the point being that evolution is really introduced by these random mutations, these random events. But these random events are all part of a larger system that's created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the system of generating these mutations is a natural part of every organism on Earth. All of us are undergoing mutations on a daily basis. I'm undergoing some mutations to my DNA. You're undergoing mutations to your DNA. Viruses are undergoing mutations to these DNA. But over time, these mutations lead to the development of new species and new organisms. So that's really the definition of evolution. It's essentially the idea that all living things, whether you're a virus or a bacteria or a bird or a chicken or a horse or a dog or a human being, all of us are subject to the environment. And this environment causes mutations or changes to our DNA. And over time, these changes can lead to the development of brand new organisms or brand new species. So COVID-19, for example, that's a virus, but over time, if it undergoes enough mutations, it'll develop into a brand new type of virus that's maybe a different type of a coronavirus. So that's really the definition of evolution. Now, yes, are there any questions?
Sorry, Brother Sadik, I have a quick question. So are you saying that the coronavirus can change while it's infecting us?
Yes, exactly. So it can change the nature of it as it's infecting. So for example, this coronavirus started off maybe in bats, or it started off in pigs or some other animal. And when it infected those animals, it underwent a change that enabled it to then infect humans. And now when it's infecting humans, it's undergoing changes in its DNA, or it's in its blueprint, that enables it to infect other humans. But each time that it infects a new human, it undergoes some change while it's infecting that individual. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
So it's, yeah, exactly. So that's a great question, because that's essentially the point of evolution. Is that evolution means that this virus doesn't stay fixed. It doesn't stay the same. It's always changing, and it's adapting to its environment. And that's the same with humans as well. So, maybe humans originally, they started maybe in Africa or in Mesopotamia, in modern day Iraq. We don't really know originally where Prophet Adam started, but it was maybe either in Africa or in one of those environments. But then as humans went to, for example, Russia, as they went to Europe in colder environments, these mutations caused them to change in terms of the way that they look. Same thing with the coronavirus. As the coronavirus goes into different environments here meaning different animals, it changes to adapt to that particular environment and be able to survive in that particular environment. Is there another question? Yes.
Brother
Yes.
Brother Sadik, I have a question. So, I thought it naturally, because it sells 99.9% match with a pangolin. I thought it started from a pangolin. Does it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't really know exactly where it started. I mean, one idea is that it started from a bat, which then infected a pangolin, which then infected humans, right? So we know that it came from some sort of an animal, but we don't know how it came from that. So we know the origin is some sort of a bat, but we don't know how it came from bats into humans. So one idea, as you mentioned,
Sadik,
yes.
My question was actually because like scientists were saying like a while ago that the coronavirus cells 99.9% match with the pangolin cells, pangolin blood cells. Is that
Yes.
true?
Well, yeah, that's true. It's around 99% with the pangolin, virus, the virus that infects the pangolin. But the virus that infects the pangolin can't infect human. I think that's sort of the idea. Even though it's 99% similar to COVID-19, the pangolin virus itself is not able to infect humans. So something happened to enable the pangolin virus to become infectious to humans. And that was probably some sort of an evolutionary event, a mutation that caused it to now become able to infect humans. And that's very common with all viruses. So for example, the last great pandemic was the flu pandemic of 1918. The idea is that initially there was a chicken that was infected with the flu virus. That chicken infected a pig, and that pig infected a human. But for it to go from a chicken to a pig to a human, it needed to undergo some sort of a mutation that would enable it to live in humans versus living in a pig. And same thing with the coronavirus. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right, good. So having said that, I wanted to now talk about some of the ideas of creationists. So what creationists say, people like Harun Yahya, is creationists say that everything has been created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and that things do not change. Essentially, they're fixed forever. So the idea being that something like coronavirus, even though we have many types of coronavirus, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is creating each one of these coronaviruses, or that everything that we see in the environment today was originally created by Allah and that there has been no change since the time that it's been created by Allah. So that's the idea of creationism. Creationism is the idea that things do not change, that they were created by Allah, by God at one point, and then they were placed on earth. And since they were placed on earth, they don't change. So that's very different to Darwinism. Darwinism says that things are constantly changing, but that this change is random and it's not driven by a system. So there is no need for God because originally we all started off as a single cell organism, and then that single cell organism just evolved over time. It was a very random series of events, and it requires no outside force like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are the two positions. Right now in the next few slides, I want to talk about the creationist position, because as Muslims, we don't believe in creationism, but we also don't believe in Darwinism. We believe in a solution in between both of these ideas, and I'll tell you what I mean. So the first creationist argument is that they say Earth is only thousands of years old. So if there's a creationist museum in Tennessee that says that the Earth is only 5,000 years old because Prophet Adam came on Earth 5,000 years ago, and because in the Bible it says that the Earth is only a few thousand years old, so the Earth is only thousands of years old. What is the Muslim argument against the Earth being thousands of years old? Well, first of all, we need to understand that the concept of time is relative. So my definition of time is different from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's definition of time. We measure time in seconds and in minutes and in hours. So for example, for us, a long time is an hour. An hour seems to us like it's a very long time. For us, a week seems like a long time. For us, a year seems like a long time. But with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a different criteria for time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, for example, Inna yawman 'inda rabbika ka'alfa sanatin mimma ta'addun. And they urge you, and indeed a day with your Lord is like 1,000 years of that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us that what we think is a long time in the eyes of Allah is actually a very short period of time. And Allah is making the analogy of 1,000 years in our eyes is only like a day in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the point being that time is relative. Our conception or our idea of time is very different from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's idea of time. And in fact, just to make this point, if we look at the history of the earth, if we were to map the history of the earth as a 24-hour clock, the earth is about 4.5 billion years old. So for a long period of time on earth, humans didn't even exist. So for the first part of time, there was only some rocks and some plants. Then we had the development of bacteria. They started to produce oxygen. Approximately 1.7 billion years into the development of Earth. Fish first appeared approximately 4 billion years into when Earth was 4 billion years old. The first fish appeared. The first land plants appeared when Earth was 4.05 billion years old. Dinosaurs appeared when the Earth was 4.4 billion years old, and humans only recently appeared. So if the history of Earth is like a 24-hour time period, humans would have appeared 1 minute before midnight, meaning at the period of 11:59, meaning humans are only recent. And this is in fact exactly what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an in Surah Al-Insan. هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا. Has mankind not thought about the period of time when he was not even a thing even mentioned? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us as humans that we think we're special, but really in the grand scheme of things, in terms of the history of the earth, for a long period of time, we weren't even created. We were not even a thing mentioned. So when there was dinosaurs, or when there were fish, when there were plants, when there were other species on Earth, there was not even a mention of humans. Humans just came recently onto the Earth. So the point here is that when creationists say Earth is thousands of years old, the Muslim position is in fact time is relative. We ourselves as humans don't really understand time with relation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Although we think 1,000 years is a long time, in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, 1,000 years is nothing. And so when they say that Earth is thousands of years old, we actually say, no, it is possible that Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And it is possible that humans have only recently come to the scene, because as Allah mentions, هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا. Humans have only recently come on earth, and it's not something that's against the Muslim concept of time or the Muslim concept of the creation of humanity. Now, another argument that many creationists say, like Harun Yahya, is that organisms are not derived from a common ancestor, meaning all of creation came from many different organisms, but that we don't share a common relative or a common ancestor. Here, what does the Qur'an say about that? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَمْشِي عَلَى رَجِلَيْنِ وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَمْشِي عَلَى أَرْبَعٍ يَخْلُقُ اللَّهُ مَا يَشَاءُ إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that there is actually a unifying perspective to all of creation, and that is water. يمشي على أربع يخلق ما يشاء. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created everything from water, and in fact, everything is coming from a single origin, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can create whatever He wants from a single origin. And in fact, if you look at some of the original Muslim scholars, there's a book from a Muslim scholar back in the year 943, so over 1,000 years ago, called Kitab al-Mahsul. The scholar's name is Muhammad al-Naqshbandi. He says, while man has sprung from sentient creatures, animals, these have sprung from vegetal beings, plants, and these in their turn from combined substances, these from elementary qualities, these from celestial bodies, these from the universal soul. Meaning, he's saying that there is a possibility that everything came from a singular origin, and that things, came from a common ancestor, which is exactly what is referenced to throughout the Qur'an. Now, the final point that creationists will say is that humans have fixed forms, meaning the human shape that we see today is the shape that has always existed. What do we say as Muslims? In fact, humans have always changed into forms and shapes based on time. There's a very interesting hadith from a companion of Imam Jafar al-Sadiq that talks about this. It's the hadith of Mufaddal. So what is the hadith of Mufaddal? It's actually a very interesting hadith. So a man once came to Mufaddal, who was one of the companions of Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, and the man was an atheist. So he was arguing with Mufaddal. Mufaddal was the companion of Imam Jafar al-Sadiq. And the atheist was saying, well, this is the evidence against the existence of Allah. Everything was randomly generated. There is no need for a creator. So Mufaddal became very sad and he started to cry, and he was crying in the masjid. And then Imam Jafar al-Sadiq came and he saw his companion, his good friend Mufaddal, and he asked Mufaddal, why are you crying, O Mufaddal? So Mufaddal told Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, well, listen, I just had a conversation with an atheist. This atheist was saying all these things about how things were randomly created. So Imam Jafar al-Sadiq told Mufaddal, don't be sad, Mufaddal. I'm going to come back tomorrow to you with the description of how we think humanity and the earth was created. And in this, it's a very long hadith. It's called the Tradition of Mufaddal. You can find it in the book of Bihar al-Anwar, but you can also find it online at alislam.org. They have this entire tradition in its totality. And one of the interesting parts from this hadith is that Imam Jafar al-Sadiq talks about all of creation. So he starts off with the creation of the earth. Then he talks about the creation of the planets, the stars, the heavens, the sun, the creation of the birds, the plants, the animals, everything. And one of the interesting comments that Imam Jafar al-Sadiq makes about the creation of the bird is he says, thus all the peculiarities of a bird's creation conform to its environment and its manner of life, meaning that a bird adapts to its environment and it's not a fixed creation. When Allah creates a bird or creates an organism, those organisms adapt to their environment and take on new features. In fact, this is really important because there was a student of Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, or a follower of Imam Jafar al-Sadiq. He's a well-known figure in Islamic history. His name is Al-Jahil. Al-Jahil comes from southern Iraq, modern-day Basra. So his full name is, I forget his full name, but his nickname is Al-Jahil. So the reason he's called Al-Jahil is because his eyes would come out of his face. So he had these bulging eyes, which means they gave him the nickname Al-Jahil. So Al-Jahil wrote a very important book called Kitab al-Hayawan, which is 7 volumes. It's a very large book. It contains 7 volumes that talks about the development of animals and the development of creatures. It's thought that Al-Jahil was actually one of the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, was particularly influenced by Imam Jafar al-Sadiq. And why is this important? Because in Kitab al-Hayawan, Al-Jahil talks about the mechanisms of evolution. So he talks about, for example, the struggle for existence. He talks about the environmental factors that causes animals and humans to change. And he talks about, he has this interesting quote from his book. He says, animals engage in a struggle for existence, for resources, to avoid being eaten and to breed. Environmental factors influence organisms to develop new characteristics to ensure survival, thus transforming into new species. Animals that survive to breed can pass on their successful characteristics to offspring. Essentially, what Al-Jahil was talking about is the entire theory of evolution, that because of environmental challenges and environmental outside influences, creatures mutate and change, and over time those changes lead to the development of brand new species and brand new organisms. Now, why is al-jahal important? There is a really important book by an author named Rebecca Stott, who the name of the book is Darwin's Ghost, The Secret History of Evolution. And what Rebecca Stott says is that Darwin was actually influenced by the books of al-Jahal and Kitab al-Hayawan, and among other things. And she calls it the secret history of evolution because, in fact, what she's saying is that long before people like Charles Darwin or Alfred Russel Wallace, the Muslim world was actively talking about the concepts of evolution. Like, it's not something which is brand new or something which is against the existence of Allah. In fact, it's a mechanism that Allah uses in order to create diversity and to create, these different environmental changes. So having said that, where do humans fit within this? Humans and evolution. So, there's many ayahs that talk about this, but I wanted to bring your attention to a few of these. Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, and you can find all of these from a book called Shi'ism, Doctrines, Thoughts, and Spirituality by Allama Tabatabai. Allama Tabatabai is one of the most important figures in modern Islamic history. He has a book called Tafsir al-Mizan, where he does the interpretation of the Qur'an, talks about the tafsir of the Qur'an, among other things. And he brings some of the quotes from the Imams, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir and Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. So what Imam al-Baqir says is, he says, Allah, since creating the world, has created 7 kinds, none of whom were the race of Adam. Meaning Imam al-Baqir says that before humans, there were 7 types of different humans that were similar to Adam, but none of them was Adam, meaning none of them was human. He created them from the surface of the earth and set them being one after another with its kind upon the earth. Then he created Adam, the father of mankind, and brought his children into being from him. And then Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq goes into further. He says, you think Allah has not created a humanity other than you? No, I swear to you that Allah has created thousands upon thousands of mankind, and you are the last among them. So, qablu Adam alfu Adam, meaning before Prophet Adam, there were thousands of types of humans, many of which are not familiar to us, many of which maybe had similar shapes and forms to us, but were very different compared to us, the modern descendants of Prophet Adam alayhi salam. So the point being here that when you look at traditional Muslim thought, the thoughts of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam, the thoughts of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, the ideas of al-Jahal, the ideas of these other Muslim thinkers, all of them acknowledge that humans as we exist today was not the traditional form that humans existed. In fact, there were many different types of Adam before modern humanity. And it's very interesting. If you go to places like Lebanon, they have the tomb of Nabiullah Sheep. He's one of the prophets of ancient times. His tomb is very large. It's over 9 feet tall. So one idea that we don't really have evidence for, but that could exist, is that maybe original humans were much taller than us, or other things. Now, even further in more modern times, you have these scholars, Sayyid Bihishti and Sheikh Bahunar, who have a book called The Philosophy of Islam. And what they write in that book is that the emergence of man on the basis of evolution from other primates is not in conflict with the teachings of the revealed religions, especially with the belief of an almighty creator of the world. But they say, however, and this is an important point, incidentally, the principles of evolution are still subject to further scientific investigation, for they are faced with much criticism, especially as they were enunciated by Darwin. So what's the point that they're trying to make? The point that they're trying to make is that humans maybe evolved from different creatures. Maybe there were different types of human before us. As Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq said, before us, there were thousands of types of humans, none of which were similar to us, but they were very different. But the point that these two scholars are making is that the flip side of that is that we shouldn't trust everything that's being said by evolutionary biologists like Richard Dawkins, because evolutionary theories tend to change on a regular basis. In fact, one example of that is this idea. About 11 years ago, they discovered a new fossil, which they say is the oldest skeleton of human ancestors ever found. And before they discovered this fossil, the idea going all the way back to Darwin is that we came from a chimpanzee. That was the idea that Darwin, among many others, came up with. However, when they discovered this new skeleton, this new ancestor called Ardi, they said that actually this new evidence suggests that the study of chimpanzee anatomy and behavior, long used to infer the nature of earliest human ancestors, is largely irrelevant to understanding our beginnings. Meaning for over 100 years, people were studying chimpanzees because they thought that would give us a good understanding to the origins of humans. But then when they found this new skeleton, they said, well, actually this overturns all of the ideas of evolution that we had, which goes back to the idea of Sayyid Behishti and Bahonar, that evolution as it is, we shouldn't trust it 100% because the ideas continue to change. And just believing in it because Richard Dawkins tells you to believe in it is not really the proper way. Rather, we need to continually investigate and think about it. So what is it that makes humans unique, and what is it that makes us different from all of the other animals? There are two major things that make us different from every other creation on earth. The first thing that makes us different is the soul, the nafs. So humans are the only organisms on Earth, the only organisms in the history of the planet Earth that have the soul, that have the nafs. Sometimes it's translated also as a ruh. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْرُوحِ قُلُ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُ مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. They ask you about the soul. Say the soul is one of the commands of my Lord, and you are not given but very little knowledge. So one thing that makes humans different from every other organism is the soul. And in fact, the soul is the one thing which we cannot explain using the modern theories of evolution. So actually, I want to ask you a question here. So how many of you have heard of Charles Darwin? Everyone has probably heard of Charles Darwin. Now, how many of you have heard of Alfred Russel Wallace? Okay. So Alfred Russel Wallace was the other person who discovered the theory of evolution at the same time as Darwin. Darwin, based on his understanding of evolution, he chose a path more towards atheism, meaning he didn't believe in God. Whereas Alfred Russel Wallace, his discovery of the theory of evolution in the 1800s led him to be closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of the main things that Alfred Russel Wallace mentions is that nothing in evolution can account for the soul of man. The difference between man and the other animals is unbridgeable. Mathematics is alone sufficient to prove in man the possession of the faculty unexistent in other creatures. Then you have music and the artistic faculty. No, the soul was a separate creation. So what is it that makes humans different from every other organism on earth? It's exactly what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. Humans are the only creature that's been created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that has a soul placed into them. This is something that was recognized by the other discoverer of evolution, Alfred Russel Wallace. So Russel Wallace and Darwin, they published their book at the same time. Unfortunately, in universities today, They only teach about Darwin. Darwin is the founder of evolution. But Alfred Russel Wallace, if you look at the history books, he discovered the theory of evolution. So scientists know Alfred Russel Wallace, and really Alfred Russel Wallace, the reason that he believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is because he said, listen, at the end of the day, evolution can explain some things, but it cannot explain the existence of the soul. How did we get the nafs? How did we get the ruh? This is something that didn't just develop through evolution. The other thing that he mentions is language. So language is something which is unique to humans. No other organism has the ability to speak. You notice in the Qur'an, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ar-Rahman allama al-Qur'an, khalaqa al-insan, allamahu al-bayan. Language was taught to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you look at modern scientists like Noam Chomsky is considered the father of modern linguistics. When he's asked about, well, how did language develop? He says that language did not develop through evolution. It's impossible to have developed over evolution because language is too complicated. Rather, it's something that just happened into humans. We don't really know where language came from, but it just happened all of a sudden. So if you look at the Qur'an, we have the explanation for how language was developed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that it was an instantaneous event that just happened to the human. So the thing that makes us human, the two things that make us human, that separate us from every other organism are language and the soul. And so to conclude, what does Islam say about evolution? This is the question that I asked at the beginning. The answer to that is actually, it's pretty straightforward. Islam does not deny the presence of evolution, but Islam actually takes a more deep and nuanced view towards evolution. Evolution can explain certain things about creation. It can explain, for example, the development of new creatures, the development of new organisms, the development of new species, but evolution cannot explain the development of the soul, and evolution cannot explain the development of language, which are the two fundamentally unique things which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to us, which are very unique compared to every other creature. So to conclude, Muslims, we as Muslims are encouraged to always be very critical in terms of our thinking. Don't just believe whatever you hear. You have to do your own investigation. So what I would encourage you after listening to today's talk is don't believe what I'm saying. I would encourage you to go do your own investigation. Go do your own reading. See, what does the Qur'an say about nature? What does the Qur'an say about language? What does the Qur'an say about the nafs? What does the Qur'an say about the creation of different creatures? What does the Qur'an say about these things? And then more importantly, what does the Prophet say? What do the Imams say? What do the awliya or the scholars of Islam say about it? Don't just trust whatever you hear from people like Richard Dawkins or from your university professor, or from your teacher. Use your own intellect, use your aql to do your own investigation and seek the truth, because this is really the ultimate responsibility on us as individuals, and especially as Muslims. So I'll conclude with that. Sorry if I took a bit longer in terms of the presentation, but if you have any questions or comments, I'm happy to take them right now.
So I heard that believing in evolution is considered haram. Is that true?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I think it really depends on, if believing in evolution will take you away from the belief of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then, the idea of it's not just limited to evolution, it's everything. So everything that leads you to a disbelief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's not necessarily haram, but, you're encouraged to do deeper reflective thinking. So as I mentioned during the discussion, the belief in evolution in and of itself is not haram. In fact, evolution is not against the basic principles of Islam. but when you use evolution or the belief in evolution as an excuse not to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then I would say it becomes something that you should try to avoid. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Good.
دكتور صادق جزاك الله خير.
Hello.
السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام. شلونك حجينا؟ شلونك مشتاقين؟ شلونك دكتور حيدر؟ مشتاقين.
جزاكم الله الخير. إن شاء الله. أحسنتم. جزاكم الله الخير. I did have a question for if you don't mind. Can we say that Islam agrees with the microevolutionary process that humans as well as animals are exposed to, rather than agree wholeheartedly with the macroevolutionary process that Darwinism tries to push, especially on our young kids that are attending colleges, and there's a huge push against organized religion to begin with, where a macroevolutionary process is being kind of forced down their throats, so to speak. Whereas, we don't necessarily advocate from a religious standpoint for the microevolutionary process.
Yes, no, that's a great way to frame it. So, what Dr. Haidar is mentioning is macroevolution, meaning that, as humans, we develop so many mutations that we develop into a brand new species. Like, let's say, or a monkey develops so many mutations that they develop on a macro level into a human. So, as I was mentioning, there is no evidence for that development that we derived from a chimpanzee. And I agree with you that is something that many universities are pushing down people's throat, but there's no evidence for it. That there was enough mutations in a chimpanzee, and then one day this chimpanzee became a human. So they tried to push that evidence, but as I mentioned, every few years they find a new fossil that actually will negate that evidence, and it suggests that there was a completely brand new creation that just developed. And so based on that finding, I think that's a good way to summarize it, that we as Muslims believe on evolution at the DNA level, and that it leads to maybe some new adaptive traits, but it doesn't lead to a brand new species as they try to advocate in university settings.
أحسنتم. جزاكم الله الخير. مشكورين.
بارك الله.
The newer, and I'm sure you've been exposed to this, is that humans share a certain percentage, a large percentage of DNA traits with orangutans or chimpanzees, for example, upwards maybe towards 80% or so. The argument that our young people are facing on the college setting as well is that explain this. How can humans share this large percentage of DNA compatibility with these primates? How would you go about countering that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would counter it with is in the following way. Number one, just because we share a certain amount of DNA doesn't make us exactly the same. So for example, 50% of our DNA is similar to bananas, right? So would we say that humans are 50% banana? No, we wouldn't. But I think the universal, the fact that we do share certain sequences really highlights that all of us come from a shared origin, a shared creator. The fact that all of these different species and creations have the same fundamental operating code, which is DNA, right? So that's one way to respond, is that, yeah, we're 95% sharing the same DNA as chimpanzees, but we also share 50% of our DNA with bananas, 90% of our DNA with mice. I mean, that's sort of like a very misleading statistic to use. I mean, you can use that with anything, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is, even though we share roughly 95% of our DNA with chimpanzees and monkeys, there are still fundamental gaps between humans and chimpanzees. This includes the following. So if you were to try to combine let's say a chimpanzee sperm with a human egg, you wouldn't be able to combine them, suggesting that there's a fundamental incompatibility on a species level. You can't, they're not the same. Even though they're similar, they're not the same. The second thing is, the thing that makes us uniquely human is language. And people have tried for a long time to teach chimpanzees language. So there was a famous monkey called Nim Chimpsky that was taught sign language. And what they found is that they could teach the chimpanzee a few letters and a few words like a banana, they could teach it water, but then the chimpanzee was never able to make that next level leap, which a young child is able to make, which, taking the environment and then going to a whole new level using this fundamental gift. And so, even though there is 95% similarity, you would say that there is still something very unique about humans, which comes back to language and the soul. So I think, what I would say is that, just the fact that things share a certain percentage of DNA similarity doesn't make them the same. In fact, there's still a lot of differences between them. And, and the fundamental thing that science has still not been able to answer and will never be able to answer is how come humans are unique among all creatures in their ability to have language and to be able to do things like mathematics and these other things. And there's still no answer to that. And the only answer will come from the Qur'an and from the fact that there is a creator.
أحسنتم جزاكم الله ألف خير مشكورين أجركم الله إن شاء الله
بارك الله بكم شكرا.
بارك الله بكم جزاكم الله
لا
ألف خير
تنسونا من الدعاء إن شاء الله نسألكم الدعاء.
نسأل الله استجابة المحتاجين لدعائكم
الله يسلمكم شكرا.
Dr. Sadik,
Yes.
what has been the new animal species that scientists have found?
What new species of scientists found? Yeah, and that's a good question. I mean, scientists are finding new species every day. There's a lot of types of new species in the ocean, new types of fish, new types of shrimp, new types of birds that they find in the jungle. So I think the answer to your question is that, as we every day we're discovering new species, and there's just so many species out there that have yet to be discovered, by humans. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
All right.
Hasn't that been put to a pause?
New species?
No, finding them.
Yeah, well, there's still people trying to find them, but it's always an active effort. So it hasn't really been put to a pause necessarily, but maybe there's less activity now because people are traveling less, so they're not having the ability to go, search for new species. But it's still always ongoing.
Thank you.
All right.
Dr. Sadik, if you would excuse me, I have to get back into work if you don't mind.
No, yeah, please, yeah. Thank you for joining. Shukran.
We'll be in touch very soon, inshallah.
Inshallah. تحياتنا. نشوفكم إن شاء الله. شكرا.
مع السلامة.
All right. Anyone else? All right, great. So if there's no other questions or comments, should we conclude with a dua?
I have one question.
Oh, yes.
Now that, everybody is in quarantine and lots of, industries and lots of, there's less cars and stuff like that, the environmental impact. How does that impact the mutations in general?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I think, there's an idea that because of the environmental change that we are being exposed at a higher level to things that cause mutations. So for example, there's a big hole in the ozone, and that causes more UV rays to come into Earth, which leads to more mutations. There's more chemical pollutions in the environment, both in the air and in the water, and that causes more mutations. And the bad thing about these mutations is they cause more disease as well. So things like cancer are increasing, things like allergies are increasing. And so, one of the responsibilities that we have as humans is to live in the environment in such a way that we minimize these types of disruptions. Because when we disrupt the environment ends up, having a big impact in terms of the mutation rate. So I think it's generally accepted that because there's more pollution, because there's more, for example, cell phone towers, there's more, there's a bigger hole in the ozone layer, that this is leading to more environmental stresses, which leads to more mutations on a micro level in humans, which could lead to more diseases like cancer, among other things.
Thank you so much, Doctor. If you don't mind closing with Surah Al-Asr and a dua.
Yes, inshallah.
جزاك
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين.